neoliberalism was liberalization of market. You know what Michael Sandel says about a market-based society? That's it. You know, you've turned your society into a market where everything is instrumentalized, everything has a price, everything is subject to market forces, and you've commodified the human condition. We have absolutely atomized and instrumentalized the life world to such an extent that of course it's impossible from where we are today. Again, conservatives warned about this. They warned that you have to keep the educational processes, the processes of community, the processes of being grounded inside of a meaningful life world. You have to attend to those so that custom keeps people from rising up in populist backlash, because they will rip the system down if you don't, and demagogues will leverage it. That is what conservatism stands for, and we've ignored it. The complexity gap that exists that demagogues walk into is the sense that people are in over their heads relative to understanding the world system. I mean, and not surprisingly, it's very hard to understand. It's very complex, and it takes a lot of specialists to understand all these areas, right? I mean, this is why we have experts in these different areas. The development of technocracy over the last 300 years in specialist areas is absolutely critical to the functioning of the social system globally. But what a demagogue says, because when a populist movement arises, usually on the back of inflation, but when a populist movement arises, the demagogue comes along and exploits that complexity gap because they don't understand that, and says, hey, you know what? These people are just ripping you off. They don't know anything anyway. Just look how badly they're screwing things up. Listen to me. I'll fix it. And so all of that institutional legitimacy transfers from the social systems then onto the demagogue, onto the authoritarian, who then uses that transfer of legitimacy to, of course, take over power. And then at that point, they start to dismantle those same institutions. And so typically you get a regression in the institutional structure. Again, conservatives warned about this. They warned that you have to keep the educational processes, the processes of community, the processes of being grounded inside of a meaningful life world. You have to attend to those so that custom keeps people from rising up in populist backlash, because they will rip the system down if you don't, and demagogues will leverage it. That is what conservatism stands for, and we've ignored it. So if you ask me, what is the real problem we've ended up in? It's not that we've not had enough. It's not that we've had too much conservatism. It's we've not had enough. America, somebody said earlier that we've been so free and things are so luxurious for us. It's true. We've focused on liberty. We've focused on equality. We've focused on freedom. And those are all good things on that side of the polarity. But what we've forgotten is the lessons of history that said we actually have to be very careful to not end up in an instrumentalized life world where people feel alienated and dispossessed. They feel like they can't get ahead. They feel like they don't have connections with, the church or with whatever those things of the social fabric that hold them in moderation. We are seeing the exact same thing they've seen through all of history, going back to Plato. And so we actually have an over-liberalization. There's a reason why they call it neoliberalism. Reagan embarked on neoliberalism, right? They didn't call it neoconservatism. That was Bush. Neoliberalism was liberalization of markets. I've said this before on many, podcasts. What Michael Sandel says about a market-based society, that's it. You've turned your society into a market where everything is instrumentalized, everything has a price, everything is subject to market forces, and you've commodified the human condition. And this is something that the liberals have really done and contributed to. Not only them, clearly. That's why we call it the uniparty. But I think there's a rebalancing trying to occur that is paradoxically, it's kind of weird, right? Because I actually think the lessons of conservatism are trying to come back to the fore. And I think we're going to turn a lot of people into classic conservatives in ways they don't know it. But it's being led by people who are calling themselves conservatives who actually are really radical and really revolutionary. So everybody is kind of screwed up in understanding what kind of political philosophical commitments they're actually making and trying to defend. But this is the system trying to restore balance in precisely these ways. So this is provisional. This is something I've been thinking about kind of relative. I'll take this off here real quick. It's kind of something I've been thinking about for obvious reasons relative to this conversation for a while now. Just sort of what's a sense of, I am a conservative, as you might have gleaned. I sort of orient probably more natively conservative. Although that gets a little nuanced, as we'll see. But I also wanted to really understand it at a much deeper level, as we've seen so much of the problematic dynamics that we are talking about here. So I created this morning. It's provisional, but it is based on a fair amount of thinking and study and work that I've done looking at this. It really is one view of some of the big picture forces that are inside of the political system. It's not nearly exhaustive. It doesn't include liberalism, for example, although a lot of what I say relates to liberalism as kind of a contrary polarity. And I would say that it looks at conservatism in three ways, probably. We can think of conservatism in some ways as a stage, I think. It is very clearly a political philosophy that articulates itself over the course of 2,000 years due to agrarian structures and the nature of human life and life conditions that accompanied that. And that's an important component. I think we can see it as a transcendental type. Conservatism holds one pole of the eros agape polarity, in particular the agape, the sort of inclusion and the attending to the temporal past, not so much eros, the creative future. And then we can also see it as a particular type, not a transcendental type, but a particular type. In this case, it is, we can look at things like brain structure, which I will get into, the neurobiology and all of that. But ultimately, I think that the neurobiology is something that probably evolution selected for, given the transcendental type that it is. Like, we actually needed, from an evolutionary point of view, the species needs both. It needs those people who were selected for eros. Those are our innovators. Those are our creators. Those are our progressives. And we also need those who are selected for threat detection, or we need those who are selected for stability and custom and stabilization of our social patterns. And those are our conservatives. Let's see. There's a lot going on here, and this is probably, I mean, we took a little bit of a risk here in doing it something like this on a live event. So I probably won't go through like all of it in great detail. I'll do a surface view of it, and then we can, talk about it or get into whatever thing is worth discussing. I got to find my cursor because I've got two screens running and my cursor's lost. Okay, there we go. All right. So the first thing I would point out, if you can see my cursor, is let's focus on the classical era. Like, that's the first structure that matters, because this is really where we begin to see conservatism arise as we would hold it today in 2024. As we think about, oh, what's conservatism? We can look back to the ancient Greeks And we can really kind of demarcate it there and go, oh, okay, this is in the classical era, this is what was occurring in the four quadrants, and this is where we begin to see it arise. So what I've done to articulate that is just giving you some representative quotes from the literature that would give you a sense of what's going on. Remember, the classic era. This is a great experience if you walk through. If you visit Europe, I think one of the things that's really profound to do. We lived in Europe and we've been there many, many times and we love it. But I have to be honest, like every time I walk into a church, I don't experience it as a modern. I don't experience it as, oh, well, what an extraordinary building this is. I experience it as a 12th century peasant. I really do. And I think to myself, I'm 24 years old. I've worked 6.5 days this week. I'm in pain. My tooth just fell out. My life is miserable. Like everything is horrible. And I'm in constant pain. I'm hungry. And life conditions are just terrible. And then you walk into this place that all of a sudden is promising salvation. And it totally changes the way you experience what that represented. And I think you need to kind of go through a similar experience here. You need to appreciate that in the classical era, people didn't live past 30. Life is brutish, short, as Hobbes said, right? I mean, that's a real thing. So we kind of need to feel what it's like to be in that era when we see what it was up to. Let's start in the lower left. We're looking at a cosmically ordered universe. As Aristotle says in Politics, Book 1, it's evident that the state is a creation of nature and that man is by nature a political animal, and he who by nature and not by mere accidents without a state is either a bad man or above humanity. Society is something that precedes the individual. Now, this is a really critical point. I know it seems nuanced, but it's super critical because liberals will reject this 2,000 years later. Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau reject this. They go to a state of nature that says that basically man is a tabula rasa. We are not a political animal first. We get politics with the rise of civilization, and it basically corrupts us. Conservatives don't believe that. Conservatives believe that man is actually fundamentally a political animal, that we are raised with duty in our blood. We're raised with a social and communal duty as part of the natural constituency of who we are as an animal. It's really important to grok that because other things follow from that. So in the lower right, we get a very deep sense of role conformity. I could have picked Plato on this. He goes on and on about this. But I went to Machiavelli about 1,500 years later, 1,800 years later. Machiavelli, of course, was one of the first realists in the modern era. He says, but we're talking about the duty that you have to play your role. He says, for it is the duty of a good man to teach others to be good and not to teach anyone to be bad. And when it is taught to everyone to seek glory and to become great, the order that gives stability to the republic is upset. Now, if you can't read social media into this, you need to read it again. When it is taught to everyone to seek glory and to become great, the order that gives stability to the republic is upset. These are not new lessons. Conservatives have known it. They have known that as a political system, you are in trouble if you create a society which is so individuated in its individual pursuits that it has no social coherence. In the upper left, how did they see themselves? Again, in the upper left, we're looking at political self-consciousness. Some of these things are a little bit arbitrary in terms of how I termed them, but I think they're fair, and I think you get the point. So the political self-consciousness in this stage of this quadrant is a caste member. And this is really where, I mean, it genuinely is caste, right? So we go to Plato. He's great on this. Gold, silver, and bronze. Those who have been given gold by nature, this is what he thought of as kind of their spiritual quality, should be leaders. Those with silver should be auxiliaries, and those with bronze or iron should be farmers and craftsmen. This goes to his idea of philosophers, the guardians, the soldiers, and then basically the bourgeoisie, the merchants. They must never desire to move out of their own class into another, for this would destroy the state. This goes into a theme that really characterizes conservatism. It's a hierarchicalism. that basically looks at people as having a place in a way to play a social role that's actually quite important. And implicit in that, by the way, is duty to the whole. You'll notice that. Duty to the collective, duty to the whole. And then finally, in the upper right, in terms of the behavioral standards, there's a duties to virtue. Again, Plato, the greatest principle of all is that no one, whether male or female, should be without a leader, nor should the mind of anyone be habituated to letting him do anything at all on his own initiative, neither out of zeal nor even playfully. In war and in the midst of peace, he must let himself be guided to his duty by his superior. In a word, he should teach his soul by long habit, never to dream of acting independently, and let the principle of justice and virtue be engraved in his heart. Virtue was a critical maypole around which the classics defined duty to the collective as an innately political animal that humans were, and that this was critical for proper social functioning. Now, we spent a lot of time on this, but if you refract some of these themes through some of what passes for modern conservatism, you can already see, some of these themes arise. I'm going to move on because obviously there's a lot here, and I don't want to it's gonna be boring if I just sit there and chat for an hour. So I'm going to try to move through this, but please raise your hand or interrupt me if you need to. So that's really the basis, and we're talking about 1800 to 2000 years of this classical era really being in place until Hobbes really comes along and breaks the spell. And then you get Locke as a response to the religious wars and so on and so forth. And so we break into the liberal era, the era that we know. The political self-consciousness changes. You go from being a caste member to now the concept is that you are a rational citizen. And importantly, both of those words mean something, right? You're rational, meaning you're deliberative, and there's a way in which you're looking out for your own self-interest, no longer for the community. And you're a citizen, meaning you're an autonomous individual within a body politic, and maybe a little bit more differentiated from a group or a collective as you had previously defined it, particularly the church, but not just the church. So from here, we take from John Adams, one of the original conservative, probably the founder of American conservatism. There's a degree of political depravity which no constitution and no laws can possibly prevent. I want you guys to just take that on board. This is critical. Conservatives knew you cannot solve an interior problem with exterior things. This is what I've been saying for the last couple hours. It's not that we need more conservatism, the classic conservatism in this country, not less. They knew that you needed the interiors. They knew that the norms mattered. They knew that you cannot exteriorize or instrumentalize through laws and regulations or technocratic interventions what really holds a body politic together or a life world together. So there's a degree of political depravity which no constitution and no laws can possibly prevent. And there's a degree of political virtue and honor to which no laws can inspire mankind. The preservation of liberty depends upon an accurate knowledge of the higher duties and upon a rational and habitual conviction of the necessity of a firm adherence to them. Adams knew exactly the problem that we face today. They knew exactly the problem we face today. They predicted it. They tried to design a system that would prevent it. In the lower left, we see the transformation in the worldview or kind of the fundamental view of how the world was organized politically from a cosmically ordered universe, divinely ordered universe, to a state of nature social contract that we see both in Hobbes and Locke. Okay, and you can already feel the differentiation that we talk about with orange come online here, right? You can already feel the way in which we're differentiating the individual against the collective, and we're making it more transactional. We're making it more free, but there's a cost to that freedom. Here we pull from Leo Strauss, one of the great conservative political philosophers of the 20th century. He was also a great Hobbes scholar. The state of nature is the state of war. The purpose of the social contract is not primarily to secure natural rights, but to overcome the danger to life inherent in the state of nature by erecting a common public power. Here, Hobbes is talking about the way in which we erect this social contract because we are no longer we're no longer subject to our duty to the state via the prior structures of loyalty and caste and all this stuff. We basically are just looking to the state to be our protector. So it's a much more instrumental relationship. In the upper right, this again, behavioral standards. And again, you can feel it. Like 2024, you can feel it. It's all about liberty. It's all about self-interest. It's all about what's in it for me. It's my gas prices, my milk prices, my whatever, right? It's all about freedom, all about liberty. No, you cannot run a railroad that way. It's only one dimension of a fully functioning, healthy politic, polis. And here we go to Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke is probably the father of modern conservatism. He was responding, if you haven't read him, he's responding to what's happening in France in 1789. He was a British parliamentarian. He was brilliant. But he was responding to what was happening in France with the revolution in France. And actually, that was what the name of his book was, Reflections on the Revolution in France. Again, we're looking at behavior. Men are qualified for civil liberty in exact proportion to their disposition to put moral chains upon their own appetites, in proportion as their love to justice is above their rapacity, in proportion as their soundness and sobriety of understanding is above their vanity and presumption. Society cannot exist unless a controlling power upon will and appetite be placed somewhere, and the less of it there is within, the more there must be without. These people were not stupid. They had seen it a lot more than we have. And we've ignored their wisdom at our own peril. They knew that if you do not have the systems of socialization, the systems of development, the systems of custom, the systems of community, the binding ties that create a virtuous human being and hold them there, you're going to have to do it without. You're going to have to do it with oppressive and coercive power. And that's, of course, going to be a problem because it exacerbates the very revolutionary thing that people don't want. And finally, in the lower right, we see, of course, a move in the socio-legal structures from role conformity to egalitarian constitutions. And here I picked Russell Kirk, again, another great conservative commentator in the American tradition. He says, from the conservative mind, true equality, the conservative believes, is moral equality. All men are equal in the eyes of God, but the radical notion of equality, absolute equality of condition, meaning equality of outcomes, leads to social dissolution. The conservative reveres equality of rights and equality before the law, but he denies that all individuals are entitled to equal rewards and equal power. This is a humongous polarity that exists between progressives and conservatives for reasons that get into the temporal polarity. The temporal polarity is conservatives are looking backwards, the progressives are largely looking forwards, but the progressives are always imagining utopias that we can make people more equal in terms of their outcomes. Conservatives are often saying the problem with that, as we'll see over and over again here, the problem with that is that it leads to all kinds of unnatural acts that end up backfiring on themselves. And that's what Russell Kirk is saying.
So it's just a super high bar.
So take everything you just said and say, well, of course it's impossible. You've destroyed every single constraining social fabric that would allow it to occur more naturally and organically. We've secularized the idea of God. Now, I'm not arguing for any of these things in particular. I'm just diagnosing it and saying, well, of course, right? We've stuck ourselves in the suburbs where we don't know our neighbors. Where our relationships are over Facebook with people we don't know. We are in jobs we don't like, which are not part of guilds where have this sort of lifetime tenure. I mean, it goes on and on and on. We have absolutely atomized and instrumentalized the life world to such an extent that, of course, it's impossible from where we are today.
100%
And
agree.
yeah, no, I knew you would. I mean, so the thing is, I think once you see it, then you start to go, my problem hasn't been anti-conservatism. It's been I've not taken what the conservatives, the true classical sophisticated conservatives knew, and started to look at what's happening with, I don't even want to call it unfettered liberalism, because that's probably not fair either. But you can see where it's out of balance with the way in which we we continue to structure society in such a way that it's so individuated that, of course, we don't have any binding custom or heritage that would help to socialize people in ways that create healthy outcomes. How the hell would it? Now, we're trying, because here we are in a Zoom room with 100 people doing an ILP, in effect, building our minds to do exactly this. So I'm not suggesting that it's a lost cause. We are doing it right now. But I do think this points the way in which we're going to have to re-aggregate the life world with norms and with standards and with community and with social obligation and to commitment, because you're not going to get away from these polarities.
And thus, in my own personal domain, that's why I see in this more spiritual side, lineage as being essential. Or a deep wisdom tradition. Pick your wisdom tradition and go super deep. Like Wilbur's been saying for how long? Just, you have to go deep, though.
No, I mean, Ken totally diagnosed it when he said, "Look, the problem with liberalism is it has no transcendent praxis," is exactly right, and it's a deep problem and blind spot. All right, moving on. Was there anything else, or can I move on, Namali?
I'll keep going.
Good. All right, so now so hopefully you guys got a little bit of that. Now we're gonna make it a little bit more complex. So now I'm going to add lines. And the lines I've just added in the upper left are sense making and identity. The lower left is worldview and values, lower right is social structures and legal and institutional frameworks, and upper right, life conditions and behavioral disposition. And let me start with identity. So here, what we see with identity line of development is that conservatism fosters an identity rooted in a reverence for tradition, duty, and the continuity of inherited wisdom. Identity here is inseparable from a connection to past generations and the social structures they established, reflecting a personal alignment with values like heritage, loyalty, duty, and respect for established authority. Like, it's really important to inhabit that sense of identity, to appreciate how safe it feels, how stabilizing it is. From the point of view of sense making, conservatives interpret reality through a worldview that values order, hierarchy, and continuity over radical change. This sense making process favors pragmatic, piecemeal solutions that align with historical and moral principles, seeing these as grounded in a divine or transcendental basis. This approach resists abstract ideals in favor of context-specific, practical wisdom, and remains wary of universal principles that ignore the nuances of individual contexts. This is why I know classic conservatism, sophisticated philosophical conservatism, is going to come back. I know it because I already know what the contradictions of Green and 2024 are. And those contradictions are they've over-universalized the life world. They've over-abstracted it. We need to get back to context. We need to get back to groundedness. We need to get back to particularity. We need to get back to locality. And what's going to help us do that is this part of the poll. There is definitely, well, I'll summarize that in a bit, but basically there's very much a preference of the particular and the here and the personal and the contextual over the abstract and the universal and the disembodied. Which, by the way, I mean, we can acknowledge that to move from the caste member into the rational citizen in the liberal era, it actually required universalizing those values because you had to do it against the church, as we know from Weber. You had to differentiate the value spheres against the group conformity of the church and the ethnocentric meaning systems that prevailed up to that time. So it makes sense why we did it. It's a certainly a partial truth, and it was very valuable, but we've overdone it, probably, right? We've probably overdone it. In the lower left, worldview. Conservatism is anchored in a worldview that emphasizes society as an organic, interconnected whole, where political life is innate to human being. Remember, I talked about that earlier. Society does and has to embody the accumulated wisdom of the past. This worldview sees society structures such as family, religion, and tradition as vital for social coherence. There's a strong preference for localism over abstract universalism, valuing the particularities of culture, heritage, and place. Importantly, natural rights derive from natural duties, not the other way around, and are centered in divinely created natural law. And here's why I told you at the beginning, there's different ways to look at conservatism, and you can see it as an amber structure arising from the agrarian era, arising from the orthodoxic monotheistic era, because it still has a lot of that predisposition, and that's one of its issues. Like that's one of the ways that its theorists are making mistakes today. And I'll get into that in a minute, but so I'm critical of both in the sense that if you're going to heal the contradictions as you move into an integral age, you're going to have to be able to heal the contradictions and the polarities on both sides. This is an area where it gets stuck. It gets stuck in the sort of the revelatory truth of amber sense making, and it's going to need to be reconfigured to transcend that. In values, conservative values emphasize loyalty, duty, pragmatism, and a reverence for established order. Moral truths are seen as objective and transcendent. This is important. With values like patriotism, hierarchy, religious commitment forming the core of a stable society, conservatives value historical continuity, seeing rapid changes potentially destabilizing to the social order, and viewing untested innovations with skepticism and leveling goals as unnatural and often oppressive. This is a concept you see over and over again in the conservative literature, this notion of leveling. And leveling, to put it bluntly, is basically the liberal notion of equity. Like, we want to make everybody equal. And from the point of view of ends, conservatives would reject that because it always ends up, as I said, it always ends up sort of warping the political processes to do that. So they insist on a means-based equality, not an ends-based equality. Moral and dignity equality, not equality of outcomes. I'll get into why Integral actually agrees with that here momentarily. We okay time-wise? Is this good pace? Everybody thumbs up?
Rob, Gene here.
Yeah.
I would just add to that one role that's one role that the courts and the judicial system has played of codifying values and virtues and having them apply to everyone in what was called the common law that really grew out of this law that applied to everything, so that you had a rule of law rather than power and men.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it goes back 1,000 years. That's well, it goes back further than that, but yeah, the English common law tradition. Okay, I'm going to assume that was a bunch of thumbs up, so I'll keep going. In the upper right, behavioral disposition. Conservative promotes behaviors that prioritize stability, respect for authority, allegiance to hierarchy, an instinct to preserve social order. This is important. I'll point this one out. Neurobiologically, conservatives have greater sensitivity to threats. They have actually more sensitive amygdalas. So the amygdala fires more quickly in the conservative, and in their anterior cingulate cortex, they are not able to basically tamp down that fear response as easily as a liberal, right? So there's a neurobiological basis for this that gets into the particular typology I talked about. And it's very easy to spot when you see how it manifests itself behaviorally and symptomatically. And then, so you can then understand it at one level, and then you step back and look at it at a higher level. You look at it at a species level, and you can understand why evolutionarily we are selecting for both, because you actually need both. You can't just sit in your basement with your, helmet on and your gun loaded. But you also don't, you don't leave your doors unlocked. Like, there's ways in which you are vigilant about certain things, and vice versa. Like, you want to be creative, you want to be innovative, you want to push into the future. Like these are cosmic forces for a reason. And it's no surprise that the species has a reflection of some of these forces embedded inside of its neurobiological selection mechanisms. In terms of life conditions, we talked about the life conditions of basically the agrarian era. So it's no surprise that life conditions are viewed as inherently structured, requiring a balance of discipline, authority, and social hierarchy to prevent disorder. These conditions reinforce conservative advocacy for systems like the family, law, and tradition, seen as essential to managing the innate fallibility of human nature and fostering societal stability. I would underscore here the innate fallibility of human nature. The reason why liberals are particularly immune to Trump as a blind spot was because they don't believe that a population could rise up on the back of an authoritarian as easily as what they did. A classical conservative would absolutely believe it. So you want to know why Trump walked into your blind spot? Because of this. It says a lot of the same. Basically, everything we've talked about, it manifests in the legal and institutional frameworks. And then in the social structures, they're time-tested and fundamental to society's stability. Church, family, nation state, market, educational institutions. Although people are viewed as morally and politically equal, they're naturally and variously unequal in all of their contexts. So social hierarchy is a natural consequence of proper metaphysics. This is really key because that's an anti-liberal notion. I personally think liberals have their metaphysics wrong, which is why I'm not on the basketball court with, LeBron James. That's not a real thing. That's not a possibility. But we're both equal under the law. We're both morally equal in our system of government. All right. I'm going to move on, but let me again stop there and see if there's any questions on the lines of development we looked at and what some of what they're showing.
Well, I would just, my reaction to it is when those phrases were written, that was in early law, which was an expression of the people that had power over others. Only when it got to the United States with our Constitution was it even written to be laws that applied to everyone, no matter what your status was. Correct? So it was not inherent in humans that we would treat each other virtuously under the law. In fact, early law didn't treat everyone equal. That's a
clearly not. Who they saw as equal under the law changed a lot. I mean, in ancient Greece, it was the male citizens. It was not the slaves. It was not women. And then, of course, that evolves over time to include more and more, encompass more and more. But sadly and tragically, it doesn't even include women until the 20th century. It doesn't include, we don't abolish slavery until the 19th century worldwide. So yeah, no, it's a long arc of that becoming more and more truthful.
So that I'm just saying that in that reasoning, this is not inherent in human being, these virtues, as is claimed in some of these writings.
No, but it wouldn't be, would it? Because that specific sequence we just talked about was that's a developmental sequence. We know from the moral developmental literature that your scope of concern and the way in which you hold your moral regard is going to move from ego to ethno to world to cosmocentric. And that's precisely what that shows.
Got it. Thank you, Rob.
Is this boring? Should we stop and do something else?
It's good. I want to hear
I can't
the integral era. Let's get into the integral era.
All right. All right. So finally, we'll do the annotations, which we'll put on here, and we'll just look at some polarities. So in sense making, we've got a polarity between transcendent and immanent. And I guess in the interest of time, I won't go through all of these, but each one of these, everything we've talked about tonight has a polarity, like the polarity between past of tested and trusted versus future, progressive and healing. In behavior, fallen but regulatable versus benevolent and perfectible. These are all polarities between the conservative view and the progressive view. Here, the polarity between God and, capital G, virtue, versus gods, lower G, freedom and progress, my gods being Amazon and profit and, all these other things, like all these descended material things of liberalism. Polarity in legal and institutional frameworks between stability promoting and progress promoting. Polarity here in social structures between hierarchical and egalitarian. Here in the lower left between particular and local and abstract and universal. And then finally, ends-directed common purpose versus means-directed common rules. Like all of these polarities are really critical, and they're going to have to get resolved. They're going to have to, well, not resolved. They're going to have to get harmonized. As we move into, this next era, which if we're right, and we may not be, but if we're right, political self-consciousness could look something like a global steward. Here I pull from Edgar Morin. The earth is our homeland. Humanity must recognize itself in its global identity. In the upper right, Spiral Guardian, I actually pulled from My Great Release. We cannot move forward without restoring the logic of growth, true, healthy, developmental growth throughout our families, companies, nations, the world. And basically, I go on, but we basically need a deliberately developmental world, right? These are behavioral standards. In the lower right, a panarchic meshwork, I pull from Roy Bhaskar. The realization of human potential on a global scale requires coordinated effort that respects the autonomy of different systems while acknowledging their interdependence. It's a meshwork of cooperation that addresses alienation. Roy is onto this because, it's pretty obvious what, ever since the critical theorists, well, actually going back to even prior to that, Marx points it out, right? That market-based liberalism is alienating. It's leaving people completely alienated. And then in the lower left, integrative pluralist sovereignty, I pull from Michael Oakeshott. The greatness of a civilization is not measured by its centralization of power, but by the diversity of associations, beliefs, and institutions that it can contain within itself. Society is not an enterprise association. It doesn't need to be a mush together holism. It is a civil association, which people are bound together by common acknowledgement of rules rather than by common purpose. Again, there's that theme of uniting under means, not necessarily ends. Notice what happens in history. Anytime we try to smush everybody together under an end, it becomes ideology, and it almost always becomes oppressive. It almost always becomes authoritarian. It's what Stalin did. It's what Mao did. It is actually the proper articulated critique, although you very rarely hear it because they're just complete. I mean, they just don't do a good job of articulating it. But it's actually what's underneath the critique of the leftist move to overarching ideological holisms. That's the risk of holisms, is they destroy the pluralism. They destroy the individuation. And then finally, at the integral era, every polarity on this map can be viewed as a dialectical integration to be navigated. And there's a whole series of, ways in which we could see how these things could be healed. Go back to depth realism and realist ontologies of moral truths, complexity theory and strong emergence as a critical natural basis for objective foundations for human progress. I say here, this is my critique of Patrick Deneen and the Catholic Integralists. So there's an entire movement on the right to try to take us back to a natural law base. The way they see the future is there's a divinely ordered, conservative, natural law based way of ordering society, and I think they are. I think they're very, very partial and not nearly sophisticated enough in their thinking. But this would be a response to them. There's a natural basis for progress that they need to accept, and it comes from strong emergence. Anyway, so it goes on and on. So that's the map. That is just meant as a survey of a few thousand years of this particular pole of political philosophy, and why I think what we're going through in terms of the Great Release and our move into the transformation age is a process of rebalancing this overall kind of meta polarity that we have attended to in the hyper liberalization and the hyper individuation of an instrumentalized market-based society in late stage capitalism with a hegemonic empire at the core. And it is no surprise that as citizens, we are dealing with exactly the problem we're dealing with right now.